Most kind and Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for life, health, and strength. Lord, we thank you for your everlasting and unconditional love. Lord, we thank you for allowing us to be safe thus far as this world deals with this horrible pandemic. Lord, we pray especially for our educators, Lord. We pray that you give them the strength, the wisdom, the patience, and the courage, Lord, to continue to provide the service of educating our youth. Lord, we ask for you to bless them and keep them, help them be of sound mind as we deal with these unprecedented times. In Christ's name, amen.
Greetings, Southeastern Conference and watching friends. My name is Salathia Robinson, and I am an English language teacher at Miami Union Adventist Academy in Miami, Florida. I am privileged this week to share with you an Adventist Black History moment in education. For the next few moments, I would like to take us on a journey of the founding of one of our nation's premier Black Adventist institutions and the people whose commitment to education made its founding turn from dream to reality. So let's journey back to 1940s America and the founding of Pine Forge Academy. For years, there had stirred in the breast of the Negro Adventists a strong desire to establish a Black Northern school as a necessary complement to Oakwood College, which has so valiantly been serving the South for so many years. However, things have been rough, and the combined efforts of the northern constituency of Blacks have produced very little results. However, now a new small conference has been organized serving 7 states and the District of Columbia, with Elder J.H. Wagner at the helm. Now, J.H. Wagner was a proven champion for Christian education. According to Dr. A.B. Pickney, he dreamed of a school for our youth. A school with a healthy rural setting where our Black boys and our Black girls could literally drink from a stream of virtue and knowledge. He surrounded himself with loyal leaders and staff members who quickly caught the vision and faithfully spread his vision amongst the community. Enthusiasm, therefore, was spread across the churches, with notable leaders like Elder Bland, who at the time pastored Ebenezer SDA Church in Philadelphia, convincing his members to pledge $1,500 to go down as part of the purchase of the land. Now, $1,500 was a lot of money back in those days, and to be honest with you, that's a lot of money for me now. With all of this, the conference announced a victory date for the project to be December 31st, 1945. Now let's pause. And let's remember what was going on in history during this time. We were at the tail end of World War II, and though this war was fought on mostly European and Asian shores, the U.S. involvement surely had taken a financial toll, not just domestically, but also foreignly. Needless to say, one wouldn't think this was a time to start such an ambitious project. But God. See, God operates on His own timeline. And the project to provide a school for his children, it blazed ahead. The search for a site to capture the vision of Conference President Wagner began. Elder F.L. Brand would again prove essential, for it was he who heard of a farm that was available for purchase near Pottstown, Pennsylvania. The president and the committee would make a trip to tour the land, and they fell in love. The rolling hills, the running streams that were fed by the Monotony Creek, the Suncrest countryside, the 20 and 25 buildings that were already established on the land. These were a sight to behold. And soon word spread amongst the people of the natural beauty that was in reach for our kids. It did not take long for them to get approval from the General Conference, and on December 14th, 1945, the conference signed a purchase agreement for $42,000 for the property. Now, the history of the land purchase to build Pine Forge should not be neglected, for it in and of itself has a deep and meaningful connection to Black history. See, in 1714, abolitionist and iron miller Thomas Rudder purchased land from Thomas Penn, where he would build his first forge on the present campus of Pine Forge Academy. This forge, although crude and short-lived, was the first of its kind in the Pennsylvania colony and would stimulate the spread of many others throughout the Pennsylvania region. In fact, several of the buildings from Rutter's ownership still remain on the campus to this day, including the residence of the principal, the Manor House, which is alleged to have once had George Washington stay there. Additionally, property of Pine Forge was used during the the closing days of slavery as a terminal for the Underground Railroad. These sites have been designated as official project of Save America's Treasures and are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, all on Pine Forge's campus to this day. So with land now purchased, the rush to begin the school year by September 1946 was underway. In fact, the slogan was heard all over the Allegheny Conference of, "Heed the call, a school by fall." This would turn into a four-spirited song. Now, I wish I could sing it for you guys, but I'm not a singer. I'm just going to say the lyrics of this song, which to me, I found great power in them. It says, "Here's a great big task to do. There's a school all bright and new. Now, it's up to me and you. Heed the call. Heed the call. Who will work with all his might until victory is in sight. Heed the call. Heed the call, a school by fall. Of a northern school we dreamed, for a century it seems. Now it's actually in view. Heed the call, heed the call. Rally to the cause with joy, for each precious girl and boy. Heed the call, heed the call. A school by fall. We have worked hard, we have prayed, our full goal to bring. By the campaign we have stayed, the victor's song we sang. Heed the call, a school by fall." Give God some praise. So news of the coming boarding school was not received without opposition, as almost anything great almost always is. There were many, both black and white, who viewed the endeavor as a mistake. However, Elder Wagner, with a radiant smile and his charming and winning ways, met with the members of the community groups to right the misconceptions, to allay their fears and refute any doubt. Elder J.L. Moran was elected as the first principal of Pine Forge, and what an excellent choice that would be. Elder Moran had previously served as the first black president of Oakwood College and had the genius for building in spite of hardship and obstacles. And with the leadership of Elder Wagner and Principal Moran, the new boarding school for our youth, Pine Forge Institute, was opened in September 1946. Instead of academy, the school was named an institute because the term does not tend to put a cap on the school grade level, Moran explained. In other words, he says, the board of directors look forward to larger things for Pine Forge. Though some of these lofty goals will never be realized, it shows intent to be the greatest, to be amongst the best. At the conclusion of its first year, 97 students were enrolled, 10 students were baptized, and its first graduating class of 6 seniors would be conferred their degrees. God had done it. Pine Forge is now one of only 4 black boarding schools in the United States, serving students in grades 9 through 12. Pine Forge in 2021 still has a strong presence with over 150 students. Illustrious alumni have passed through its halls. To Barry Black, the 62nd chaplain of the United States Senate, Clifton Davis, an American actor, songwriter, singer, and pastor, Sidney Freeman Jr., an educational theorist, author, and social scientist at the University of Idaho. Yet none of this would have been possible had it not been for the vision of a coalition of people who came together to see a long-sought dream turn into reality. We've mentioned Elder Wagner, Principal Moran, Elder F.L. Bland, but there were many others who played a part, such as Dr. Grace Kimbrough, who loaned the down payment for the purchase of the property, and whose name graces to this day the girls' dormitories. Also Elders J. Neff and Elders J. H. Lawrence, who played a central role in the early establishment of Pine Forge. Now, if there's one lesson to be learned from this brief retelling of Prime Forge's founding, is that we are mightier when we work together. Education that transforms is not only the job of the teacher in the classroom, but it truly takes on life-changing power when all entities of church and community come together to work for a common goal. And though I'm biased, I can unequivocally say that there is no goal greater than creating safe and inclusive spaces to educate our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Thank you for listening, and let's continue to remind our children of our rich history, not just in February, but the entire year long.
Good evening and welcome to Education That Transforms. I'm Barbara Davis, your host, and joining me today is our co-host, Magali Arthus, and our very special guest, who is a son of Southeastern Conference. And I must say, I'm so proud he's my cousin. He's Dr. Eric Walsh, for those of you who don't know him. And at this time, Dr. Walsh, we're going to ask that you will introduce yourself to the audience. Thank you.
Well, yes, I've been on before a couple times, so glad to be back. And I guess what's relevant for today is that I went to public school in Miami, finished high school at Miami Palmetto Senior High School, and had never gone to Christian school all those years. Very involved with church, of course, at Perrine, but it wasn't until I went to Oakwood, now Oakwood University, that I had my first experience with Christian education, Black Christian education, Black education, all of the above, and it transformed my life. So I'm a strong advocate for Christian education because that I was able to go on from there and get my medical doctor degree from the University of Miami there in South Florida, and a master's and a doctorate degree in public health from Loma Linda University. Also, of course, did 2 residency training programs, one in family medicine, one in preventive medicine, and have worked all throughout government at the CDC, on committees for the CDC, even on council committees for 2 U.S. presidents, Obama and for George W. Bush. So God, he took me from, relatively humble beginnings. If you think of what a Christian HBCU like Oakwood is, to some very significant halls in this country. And so it's a little about myself, and I look forward to our conversation today. All right, so this is a part of a sermon that I've done before on education, and so I wanted to just share this with everybody. The scripture I use here is John 8 and verse 32, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I come from a stance with education, that education for Black Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, even Africans on the main continent, education is a force for liberation. The scripture says that if you know the truth will set you free. And so when you talk about even moving things forward in terms of social justice and other things, you can't really do that without proper education. In fact, bad education will keep you back in more than one way. So one of the things that seems to be true, and this is a family watching television, the slide is called The Dumbing Down of America. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about this, but what we know is that television brings you down from theta waves in your brain down to alpha waves, put you in almost a state of hypnosis. And then whatever is being sent to you through television, and I have some other talks I do on sex and purity that shows that if young people begin to watch television at a young age that's full of violence or sex, they're more likely to get involved with those things at an earlier age. It transforms the way girls see themselves and boys see themselves. But there was also a study that showed if you start to watch television, if a kid watches TV before they go to school, it impacts how well they do in school, probably because it drops them down from theta waves in the brain, which are the waves in the brain which are most important for critical thinking, reasoning, and higher level functioning, down to more of a state, like I said, of almost of hypnosis, or you're almost asleep walking. So parents should not ever have their children watch TV and then send them to school. And there's a great book Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt wrote, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. There are more than one of these books where they talk, people I believe she was the one that was in the Department of Education, and just talks about how the government actually designed education, public education in America, with the end of really kind of just controlling people or creating soldiers or factory workers and that type of thing. So it wasn't that education was designed to create critical thinkers. It was for certain classes of people in this country, but not for everyone. And so you could create underclasses permanently by the way you educate people. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, since we just came out of a very heated political time, he says democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy, therefore, is education. And you see that in some of our elections. People really have no idea what's going on. We were just talking about climate change, and we could talk about the coronavirus. There's so much misconception, and people are so easily deceived because they don't have critical thinking skills. If someone says something on YouTube right now, people send it to me like, look at what this person says. I say, the person literally can't even pronounce the subject they're discussing, and you think they're an expert in it. They literally aren't even pronouncing it right. Somebody showed me a thing about a guy who quoted DNA as deoxyribonucleic acid, and he was saying the deoxy is God and this, and I'm like, if you studied chemistry, that's clearly not what any of that means. But again, if you don't have critical thinking skills, you won't see that. So how does U.S. education do? Well, there's the 3-yearly OECD program for international student assessment. This one's a little bit old, but it compares the knowledge and skills of 15-year-olds in 70 countries around the world. The United States ranked 14th of the 34 countries in reading, 17th for science, and below average at 25th for mathematics. This is the greatest nation in the world. We did not perform very well. However, the picture changes when lower achievers, Blacks and Hispanics in the United States, are broken out by race. White and Asian students in the United States are generally among the best performing pupils in the world. Did you get that? So as bad as America does, if you segregate the data by race, white and Asian students in America actually jump to the top of the world's list. So what happens to Black and Latino students? Well, Black and Hispanic students in the United States have very high rates of low achievement. Black and Hispanic students in the United States do outperform their counterparts in all African and Hispanic countries. So you come to America, your child will do probably better than if they stayed in a developing country if they're Black or Hispanic. However, they will be permanently or significantly, I should say, behind white and Asian students. This is a problem because this produces what we call the achievement gap. This is old data up to 2004, but achievement gap is bad. In fact, we know that every summer, the achievement gap is sustained, right? It's during the summer that privileged children with parents with resources, actually make sure that their kids continue to advance in the 3 months of summer. Poor children, Black, Latino, poor white children, and never overlook that poor white children suffer the same way. It's unfortunate almost. They're almost a forgotten group of people, but they suffer the same way. So during the summer, guess what happens? The wealthy white, the children with means, especially white ones, they go up. They continue to ascend the educational ladder. But every summer, Black, Latino children, poor white children, they get stuck. They stay at that level. So while their counterparts go up, they stay at the level they were at the end of the school year. And then the school year starts, they go up together. And every summer, so by the end of, by the time you do 12 grades, one group has a definitive advantage over the other groups. And this is a major, major problem because these gaps really do contribute to a lot of things we'll talk about in a second, but definitely contribute to poor health outcomes, as we'll talk about here in a second. So we have something called a school to prison pipeline. The prison industrial complex is a concept that was introduced by social activist Angela Davis. And it really speaks to the fact that if you don't educate children properly, but specifically Black and Latino children, there is a school to prison pipeline. In the public school systems in America, Black children, especially Black boys, more than probably anybody, and Latino boys are probably second, are far more likely to be suspended or expelled from school. So that happens at an early age. And as they spend less time in school, there's more room to get in trouble outside of school. So they're far more likely to get into juvenile detention systems and the juvenile penal system, penal system. And so when that happens, you begin this process of almost grooming them for prison. And it starts by and the studies are overwhelming, over disciplining them at young ages. Great old book, and I would have to look to see where I can find it. Is a book called "Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys." And it was by Jawanza Kunjufu, a Christian Black nationalist. I actually met him in Atlanta once. And it was a powerful book because what you find is that the system is designed to basically weaken and beat down Black boys. And I wish I could say that since that book was written probably back in the 80s, that things have gotten better. But I think when you look at the numbers today, things have not changed very much. And so you fund it, the public education system suffers to get funding, but they will fund the prison system to the hilt, privatize the prison system, but they don't help private schools in general. So it's interesting. Private prisons can get funded and helped, if nothing else, by just sending them prisoners and paying for the prisoners. But private schools don't get that advantage. And so, there are a lot of people on the right who are for school choice, but we don't have school choice. So this is one of the great challenges to Christian education, Adventist education, is cost, as we can talk about when we go into the discussion. Well, how does this pan out? Well, as you can see here, on the y-axis of this graph, the percent of adults ages older than 25 years with poor or fair health. And on the x-axis is the amount of education they got. The dark blue, the darker the blue, is the less education you've had. So the less education you have, the more likely you are to be in poor health. So education is like going vegan. I want people to get, or I shouldn't say vegan, whole food, plant-based. We talked about that before. Good education is good for your health. It is literally what we call a social determinant of health. Without proper education, people will suffer poor health consequences. There are a myriad of reasons for that. We'd have to do a whole nother show on it, but I want people to understand that an investment in education is an investment in health. So teachers are technically healthcare workers, if you think of it that way, because teachers help make sure kids are educated. Here's a great one too: homicide risk in education, right? So if you live in a neighborhood where the percent of residents age 25 plus with less than a high school education is low. You see that the darker the bar on this one. Relative likelihood of death by homicide, adults age 18 to 64. So the lighter the bar, the less educated you are, and the more likely you are to have to be killed by or have homicide events happen in your area, neighborhood, on and on and on. Education, therefore, is also protective against violence, which is pretty profound. So there's a great study, a great article that was put in Orman College Magazine back in May of 2012, where they said our long-term prosperity will be more about minds than mines, as labor-intensive manufacturing jobs like those in the car industry inevitably dwindle, and back office processing jobs in industries like financial service, telecommunications, and IT disappear offshore. They will need to be replaced with jobs of a highly educated workforce. So we've got to be preparing our children for a very changing work system. And this is from 2012, and it has come to pass just as they said it. Compounding this problem, we are likely to follow other developing economies and seeing a considerable reduction in the growth of domestic jobs in areas like public service, healthcare, and education that are driven by government expenditure. So because of the pandemic, healthcare and public service probably are going to go up, but we're going to keep seeing a lot of what we normally thought where we could get jobs actually disappearing. So this author, Richard Swanson, had an article, Hyper Jobs, the new higher level work and how to grow into it. So how do you create tomorrow's workers? This is part of what education is about. He says, discovering and finding the why of things in science. That's one of the things you need to be able to do, or business or their lab. So we need to create kids that can discover the why, kids that are creative, kids that can implement things, right? Make the fruits of creativity real, who are influencers. And a lot of kids are good at that because they like social media and physical action. So interacting with things that the body in mindful ways. But these are the three that I thought were interesting. In the article, he says there are three enabling skills: basic mental skills such as perception, classification, and emotional release; symbolic thinking and interpretation, including language, mathematics, and scientific notation; responsibility, here's the one I like, including global consciousness, ethics, and a religious sense. He says that if you have these things, in other words, if you have a purpose that is higher than yourself, if you've been educated to have that, you're going to have an advantage getting jobs later on. So what happens to our children? Well, they suffer from poor nutrition. We've talked about that before. Marijuana, alcohol, drugs, overly exposed, overly, for example, malt liquor, only advertised to black people, basically. Menthol cigarettes, only advertised to black people, basically. Disproportionate advertisement for junk foods, fast foods, so on. We still have the threat of racism on many fronts, damaged families. And so how does Adventist education play into all of this? Well, we have an advantage. Here's a picture of the three Hebrew boys and Daniel saying no to the king's meat and his wine, because we have a holistic education system. And here's what the studies, this is what I want to really get to you guys before we go into our discussion. Our advantage is Adventist. William Jennings, professor of education at Long Beach State University, published a paper on 90 meta-analysis study on education. Private religious schools attendees ended 12 months ahead of traditional public school or charter schools. The achievement gap was 25% narrower, so it helped fix that achievement gap. They performed even better in behavior. Between 2006 and 2010, the Cognitive Genesis study analyzed test scores of 51,000 plus students based on the Iowa Test of Basic Skills for grades 3 to 8, and the Iowa Test of Educational Development for grades 9 and 11, and the Cognitive Abilities Test for all grades, as well as surveys completed by students, parents, teachers, and school administrators. In each subject category, students attending Adventist schools scored higher than the national average. They also scored higher than their expected achievement based on assessment of individual ability, a factor few other schools even measured. One of the most dramatic findings is that students who transferred to Adventist schools saw a marked improvement in their academic achievement. The more years a student attended an Adventist school, the more his or her performance improved. And this is Alyssa Kito, as a professor of education, La Sierra University. So what does Ellen White say about all this? She says, our ideas of education take too narrow and too low a range. There is a need of a broader scope, a higher aim. True education means more than the pursuit of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and the whole period of existence possible to man. She says, true education, it is the harmonious development of the physical, mental, and spiritual powers. It prepares the student for the joy of service in this world and for the higher joy of wider service in the world to come. She says it is of highest importance that every human being endowed with reasoning powers should understand his relation to God. In our schools, the work of redemption is not carefully studied. Many of the students have no real concept of what the plan of salvation means. True education does not ignore value of scientific knowledge or literary acquirements, but above information, I like this, just like they said it's going to be valuable in the future, it values power. Above power, goodness. Above intellectual acquirements, character. The world does not so much need men of great intellect, Ellen White says, as of noble character. It needs men in whom ability is controlled by steadfast principle. Character building is the most important work ever entrusted to human beings, and never before was its diligent study so important as now. Last slide. Never was any previous generation called to meet issues so momentous. Never before were young men and young women confronted by perils so great as confront them today. So I wanted to give some info on the benefits of Adventist education, and then of course talk about, from the Spirit of Prophecy perspective, that when we educate a child, if we educate them simply for how well they can do in this life, we've given them a miseducation. If you're not educating that child for all, like as Ellen White says, for the entire time of possible existence, meaning eternity as well, we've shortchanged the child. And this is one of the reasons Adventist education is so important.
Wow, Dr. Walsh, I'm so happy that you were able to share with us, and the information, the research corroborates so much with what we already know, especially having gone through Adventist education and now working in Adventist education. We know that we're providing superior education, but the data and the facts lend to that, and we thank you so much for sharing that. We would like to start asking you a few questions, if you don't mind, and we'll get into it. Our first question for today: would you say that the disparity in economic resources, food insecurity, medical care, and investments that we see outside, and you mentioned them in your slides, especially in the threats to our youth, do you find that to be so in the Black Adventist communities as well? Or
Yeah,
can you
there's
share
some
that?
some other slides I didn't put in, but they show that, in fact, Black Adventists, if you were to really tease out the data, probably the most educated Black people in America. The highest number of grades or level of education acquired, and even in percentage when you compare to other denominations that are predominantly, whether Black or not Black, Black Adventists actually do very well in education. And I think if you grew up going to Adventist churches, you see this. We tend to do well, and there's a couple of reasons for it. Spiritually, if you tithe, Isaiah says, God will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth. And the other, of course, is the Sabbath gives you a distinctive blessing as well. So tithing was where you get the money, the resources poured out from the windows of heaven. The Sabbath is where you ride on the high places of the earth. So you have these kind of inherent spiritual advantages, but then you also have this move away from stimulants, alcohol, drugs. You remove meat out of, or at least some meat out of most people's diet. At least most Adventists don't eat pork and stuff. So, there's a health advantage that goes along with it. And then there's this whole school system, the second largest parochial school system in the world by one of the smallest denominations, right? So we have you go anywhere in the world and you can basically find Adventist schools. All over the Caribbean, Central South America, Australia, Asia, anywhere you go that, where basically communism doesn't exist, or it's not dominated by some other religions, we have schools, and we have them all the way to terminal degrees. Medical schools. The only thing I've never seen us have is a law school, which I think we should get one. But so that says a lot. And it's why we are so well educated and why we do so well. That doesn't mean that they're inside of our Black churches, there are not pockets of people who do not get moved along as well. And I think as a church, we can do better about it. And one of the things that hopefully we get to talk about is the cost of Christian education and how it probably should have been paid for to make it more accessible to more of our members and more of the community.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Walsh. And you did mention about the cost of Christian education. Yes, it's we're not funded as we should. However, we do have what is called school choice. You did mention that earlier, but we do have Step Up for Students. And so, but what we find is that a lot of our parents, our Adventist parents, are really not taking advantage.
That's a Florida thing.
That's a Florida thing.
Yeah, I was like, most of the country doesn't have that.
Right.
That's good.
You don't have it there. So
yeah, that's good.
I would just like to know, and for you to share with the audience, what cultural, we talk about, one of your slides talk about the U.S. education and the gap, the achievement gap in education. You referred to whites being more of an advantage because they are more susceptible to the higher learning during the summer and they continue with learning. However, I would just like to know, and for you to share with the audience, the cultural disadvantage that Black and Brown students have to contend with when they attend predominantly white schools.
A very nurturing school of any color can actually be good. So if you go to a white school and there are people who are invested in you and they welcome you with open arms, you can do well. I do believe that. And I would say that you'd find a lot of people who anecdotally have those stories that they went to, they're black or brown, they went to predominantly white schools and actually had really good experiences. The challenge a lot of times is that that isn't the case. I can tell you my own experience at Miami Palmetto Senior High School, right there in South Florida, being called the N-word every day for years, watching them draw and write racial epithets on the walls of the bathrooms, even having teachers who bought into racist ideology and allowed students to bring it into classrooms when I was in high school. So yeah, like I said, when I was living and growing up in the first part of my schooling in Connecticut, I did see some of that. I mean, but basically almost non-existent. There were a couple of teachers that weren't very black friendly. But the point is, when you don't see yourself at the head of the classroom or in leadership positions in a school as principal, vice principal, that all by itself can take a toll. It's important to see that even you're represented in the classroom, and not just in sports, which is what happened at Palmetto. The black kids were all bussed in from Perrine, and then they try to convince all of us to play sports, especially me. They wanted me to play football. So being at those schools can create a sense of less than, of lowered worth if you're not being supported elsewhere, like through church or through family or something, and that can cause some serious problems. So I think if you're a family and you have a black child and you send them to a predominantly white school, you've got to find some other ways to make sure that child connects to their culture and is fortified in self-worth.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I'm going to touch back on something you mentioned, the cost of Christian education. A lot of times parents raise concern and members of our community about the fact that Adventist education, they feel, is expensive. We don't have money for this, they say, we don't have money for that. And so sometimes our schools are compared to as less than because of that. Some say that the church should give more, and some say that if you're an alumni, you should give back. Is there any fix to this issue, you think?
Well, both of those things are true. The church should give more, and alumni should give back. I read once, or maybe I heard it, but I want to say I read it, and somebody can maybe send it in to you. But that the Sister White actually said that the teacher's salary should have been paid out of the tithe, like the pastors are. I've heard a couple pastors tell me that before, actually, as I think about it. That makes a lot of sense. I didn't put these slides in either, but one of the best indicators of who will stay a Seventh-day Adventist is if they go through Adventist education. The Jesuits, the Catholic Church, say, give us your child for I forget how many years, and they will be a Catholic for life, right? Even when they leave the church, when they need to be married, they come back to the Catholic Church. When they need to when they need to baptize their baby, they come back to the Catholic Church. When they need to have a funeral, they will always come back to this church, even if they never practice it one day in their life. The same is true for us in a sense. If we put our kids in Adventist education, it is the best hope in many ways we have that they will remain Adventist, because they will get the information, the Bible study, the culture. Now, our schools obviously still have to teach. Ellen White, in her day, was talking about how to teach. Schools weren't teaching salvation the way that they should. That's a lesson to us today, that we need to make sure that is at the forefront. But let me say this. One of the reasons the church should invest in schools is it is literally probably our most successful evangelistic tool we have.
Amen.
Especially when you go into some of the areas that our schools exist in, and if you get kids from the neighborhood who are going to subpar public schools and you are able to get them into our schools, you could literally get whole families. And I've seen that happen, where the whole families become Adventists because they come to church for the programs the kids sing in and so forth, and they come to know Christ and join our denomination because of that. So that's the church definitely should. And I would argue that I would say the tithe would be a great way to do it. I'm sure now that's way too complicated and political, something that would have had to probably start from the beginning. But the church, to me, should prioritize that way. Even if, and I'm going to say something radical, even if it meant doing away with a layer of the church, there was no more union or no more division or whatever. You did away with the whole thing and sent all that money down to Adventist schools, you would get far more out of that than an extra layer of bureaucracy in a time of technology. So those opinions are mine, not of the hosts. But on the flip side of it, the alumni, we don't do enough, So I at Oakwood, instead I give money to Oakwood, but and more importantly, I think I try to find students who need help, and give money directly to them. Sometimes, because there's just no way, especially international students, there's really no way for them to get money. So as alumni, we all have to give back. And it's bigger than just the alumnus. Any Adventist, black, white, or brown, blue, or pink, every Adventist should be given money to support their local schools. And if we did more of that, actually, we would be fine.
And on that same vein, Dr. Walsh, and I'm glad that you mentioned that we know funding is so important, but are you aware of any Black SDA contributors to our endeavors in Adventist education?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that people do it. I mean, the way that Jesus teaches that you're not supposed to let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. So, I try, even when I give stuff, I try not to say anything about it. And I'm sure there are a lot of other people like that. But there are people I know who give. I know there are people who do support. We just have to make it as easy as possible for people to support our schools financially, make it so that they can do it online, however it is. But we definitely need to send more resources to our schools.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Walsh, I would like to ask you a different type of question. As a medical doctor and as someone who is sought after for educational speaking engagements, you have the benefit of seeing it on multiple sides, as well as, being so heavily involved in your church and elder and such. Can you tell us what you've seen as some of the benefits of Black Adventist Christian education that you've observed as you've traveled and spoken to people?
I see. One of the things I see is that there is, just as Kennedy was saying, there is those who are educated in Adventist schools like Pine Forge Academy, like Miami Union Academy, GAAA in Atlanta. I could go on and on to for the one in DC, Northeastern in New York. There is a sense of purpose that is associated with their education that makes them stay involved with their church, and more likely to engage in their community, in my opinion. Last weekend I spoke on a Vesper service by Zoom for Northeastern Academy alumni of Black Adventist Academy here in New York. And I was very impressed with how well many of those people are doing. I mean, they go into a school that many would say is not a good school, and yet they own businesses, lawyers, doctors, all kinds of people have come out of those schools. And you don't hear that or see that, and it's unfortunate. I mean, I know right now a young man who's doing surgery at Howard University in residency training there, and went to Pine Forge Academy. These things don't make it out enough. And you think somehow your child is going to get a disadvantage by going to these schools from an education standpoint. But a lot of parents don't understand. It's not just standardized tests. It is the ability to be creative, to think outside the box, and most importantly, have a connection to the higher power. So I see those kids who go into it, and I really regret now, when I look back at my high school experience, I wish when I was in Miami, I had been able to go. My mother was a single mother with 3 kids. My older brother was kind of out of the house by then, but she had a lot of financial burden. So I don't know that we ever even considered it really, but I regret it now. I wish I could go back in time and have gone to an Adventist school for high school. One, I probably wouldn't have been called the N-word so much, but number 2, I would have gotten Christian teaching, that would have helped establish me. If I didn't go to Oakwood, I'll be honest with you, after going to public schools all my life, I don't know that I'd be a Seventh-day Adventist now.
Wow, that is wow, to hear that, that's so profound and true. Dr. Walsh, thank you for sharing and for sharing so honestly. I would like to know if you could tell the audience whether or not you think we can turn around intra-racial prejudice in our Black community. If so, how can we do that? How can we turn it around in our Black community?
Are you speaking to like kind of Black prejudice against other Blacks?
Yes.
Yeah. So on one way, some people call that colorism. Mm-hmm. There is a thing as colorism, they say, when, so darker skinned Blacks are not liked by lighter skinned blacks or vice versa. I would throw in there that there is sometimes some prejudice against blacks who come from outside of the country and then come into the United States. I mean, when I was growing up, that was a major contention. Black Americans in Connecticut and West Indians, and there was contention for jobs, and you almost think the man or the system pitted them against each other in a sense when you kind of looking back at it. But there is a problem around that, and I think there's a lot of misinformation around. If you look at colorism, for example, there's just a lot of bad history of prejudice because, again, if you don't value yourself, then the closer you think you look to your oppressor, the more value you think you have. And that has been part of the legacy of slavery and racism in this country. So there were churches in the South where there was a comb hanging from the door, and unless your hair could pass through this comb, you couldn't enter the church. So someone like me would have had absolutely no hope of going into the church, even when I had a full head of hair, because my hair would have been too kinky to go through the comb. And that's how they would put people out. We have a legacy of this. And unfortunately, to bring it back to education, without teaching true value and true self-worth, these forms of prejudice exist. And this is one of the reasons why when you go to an HBCU, regardless of not just Oakland, but any of the HBCUs, you almost get to see where this gets minimized a bit, because in those situations, it is our collective identity that is important. And it's the same, I'd have to argue for high schools that are predominantly Black. That you get a collective sense of who you are, and that empowers you and changes the way we look at each other.
Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Walsh, I'd like to go back to something you mentioned in your slides. You showed us information on less education and its link to worse health overall. Is there a solution to the challenge that we face of ensuring that healthcare among Blacks is a priority, or shall I say a greater priority?
So, I like this question because I think there's two things that you got to parse out from this question. One is healthcare, which is what Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, who else? Going all the way back to when John Kerry and McCain were running for president, or Hillary Clinton. Everybody talks about the healthcare. You know what nobody talks about? Health. Right? They want to solve a problem for healthcare, but people have confused healthcare for health. You could have the best healthcare system in the world and people still drop dead early or still suffer from disease early, because true health doesn't come when you go to the hospital. True health is what you have by never going to the hospital, never needing the physician, never needing all the fancy tests and procedures. So, when you look at it, education, then, this is why I said what I said about education, because it is a social determinant of health. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to be able to understand the nutritional label on a food package. The more likely you are to have had classes in college or even in a good high school that helps you to understand how to make better health choices, to make you understand what it means when you see a commercial for a new drug and they say, may cause side effects such as, and they list off 15 million things, including death, right? So you're going to take this medicine for your rash, but it might literally kill you, right? So when you understand, the more educated you are, the better you are going to be able to balance the risk benefit ratio that basically is our healthcare system. That's what our healthcare system is. Even the coronavirus vaccine now, people are all over the place with it, but it's a simple risk benefit ratio that you have to sit and look at and decide whether or not you want to do it. But unless you are properly educated, you cannot. It's difficult to be able to pull that off in terms of understanding those things. But the better educated you are, you also are more likely to get a job that will be sustainable, where you'll get healthcare insurance, but also, again, you'll have the resources to live a healthy life, to have other social determinants of health, a good job, a good house, access to good transportation, and on and on and on and on. Education is one of those fundamental things that if you remove it from the equation, people are simply not going to be healthy. And there's a lot of reasons why. So again, Why isn't education better funded? Why isn't education better supported inside the church, in the government? It's a tough question to answer, but it is literally a direct link to the health of the population.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Walsh. And as it relates to, we know when it comes on to our Black boys, what they go through. You talk about the prison pipeline in one of your slides. Obviously, it has to do with funding. It has to do with the gap in education. And so we know at risk, mainly, we have our Black youth. And so, and they're, of course, boys. So how can we educate our young Black Adventist boys to navigate and succeed in today's society, especially when the gaps that are systematically put in place?
Well, let me step back for a second, because I don't want to paint the picture. All of the problems of Black America come from outside of Black America. As bad as racism is, the truth of the matter is there's a lot of internal things that we could fix. And one of them is our families. So unfortunately, disproportionately, Black boys are more often to not be raised with their fathers. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Fathers are disproportionately in prison, and other factors that play into it. So the first thing you got to say is, where are our boys getting positive male role models? One of the reasons Black schools are so powerful is if you have really good, strong Black male teachers and principals and educators, you can build in a lot of that. I can tell you, growing up, when I went to church, I had elders who were executives in insurance companies. Dr. Roy Kellerman was one of our, he was a physician, and he was one of our mentors in a sense, and someone we aspired to be like, running his own practice here in Connecticut. And I could go on and on. Those connections were important because I didn't have a father. So seeing men be men, seeing them be good men, good to their wives, good to their children, involved in church, having a business and being well educated, all empowered me. And I think that's one of the first and most important steps. So one of the ways that our schools actually help is simply by allowing for those role models. Then there's also the point of the nurturing. A lot of our Black boys are often taught to be tough and hard, and boys don't cry, and we punch on them, we push on them to try and make them tough. So having schools where the teachers are invested in them. One of the things I felt when I went to Oakwood all those years later, so I wasn't a little boy when I went, obviously, was I felt cared for. I felt like the professors actually cared whether or not I did well. I didn't get that in high school from most of my teachers, the majority of my teachers. But every class I took at Oakwood, I felt this person actually cares whether or not I do well. And that, and all of the teachers weren't Black. We had white teachers, one or two white teachers, Asian teachers at Oakwood, but they all cared. Part of that is the Christian environment, clearly. But obviously, when it's predominantly Black, each of those Black, especially a lot of the Black professors, they saw you like as if you were their own child. They wanted you to succeed. And I would argue that that's a big part of what Black boys need. In studies around why young men, Black or otherwise, join gangs, a lot of times they're looking for family. And what a good school can become is family.
Wow. A family setting is so important. So yes, thank you for sharing that. Dr. Walsh, in your sharing of slides with us, you talked on our advantage, the advantage of the Seventh-day Adventist system. Unfortunately, we find that our rosters are filled with non-Adventist students. Let me rephrase that, I'm sorry. We welcome them, we're so happy that they're there, we love that they're there. But my question is, many of our students are non-Adventists, but our own Adventist students that go to our churches don't buy into our product. So for them, they're chasing better, and they turn to other schools, other Christian schools, and many times the public school, not for lack of funds, but just as a choice, as an alternative, because they think that it's better. And that's what I meant to say. So what do you think causes that? What do you think, why do you think they go after something outside when, like you've presented the data, our schools are so advantageous?
Well, first of all, each individual school has to make the case for their school. So you got to collect this data. You got to have alumni come back and speak at the churches of the benefits. Then you have to show their success. I remember when it was time to go to college, I was in Miami then, and there was one family who they were totally against Oakwood. They just thought it was the worst thing they could ever do was to send a kid to Oakwood. They need to go to Ivy League schools or big fancy public colleges or universities. The first son did not go to Oakwood and went to one of the other schools. The second son insisted and went to Oakwood. Which son do you think is by far more successful today? It's the one that went to Oakwood, right? But that lesson never got trickled back down to the very church where these arguments were had that you shouldn't send your child to Oakwood. I would submit that if you want more of our children to go to schools, you've got one, the schools have to be run well. And I don't know what schools are like, Adventist schools are like anymore. I don't go into Adventist school, but they have to be run well. They've got to have all the resources they need. No matter how you figure out how to find it, they've got to perform well on objective tests, as we talked about on the slides. Because you can't, what we cannot do is ask them to say, listen, we're going to give you a Christian experience in exchange for the best possible educational experience. The parents have to understand they're going to get the best of both worlds. The people in the world kind of see that because they understand the product they're getting in the public school. So when they see our product, it's like, wow, this is a good product, and my kid is going to be taught some moral content. Even if they're not Adventist, they're like, well, this is going to be a safer, more structured environment. My child is going to wear a uniform. They're going to pray, blah, 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 blah. The people who go to church, they're like, my kid, I pray with my kid at home. They go to church every weekend. Do they really need this? I want an educational advantage, a pure educational advantage. We have to be able to make the argument that you get that as well. And here's the truth. Like anything else, we have to take a hard look at ourselves. If we're not doing that, what do we need to do to get there? Because the people inside the church, unfortunately, they talk, and they will, unfortunately, literally sometimes be our own worst enemy in talking bad about our schools, gossiping about our schools. Unfortunately, that is the reality. Because listen, the devil doesn't want, with what we know about how going to Adventist school protects our kids from leaving the church, the devil does not want our kids going to Adventist schools.
I agree wholeheartedly. Dr. Walsh, as we wrap up this session on Seventh-day Adventist Black History Edition, I would just like to know from you and for you to share with the audience, we have limited the amount of Black history taught in our schools. That's something that I, as superintendent, I am aware of. That's something that I was challenged about last week by Dr. Bird. And today I'm saying to you that we are aware that the Black history is not taught in our schools as it should be. And if it is there, it's just a tiny bit, and it really is like insignificant per se. Some fear that the possibility of radicalizing students, and others fear it's too much information. They figure that, teaching Black history, of course, it's going to ignite quite some different feelings than we're comfortable with. However, what is your opinion on this matter? And this is our last question. So if you would like to, you can also do a wrap up as you answer this concerning Black history being taught in our schools.
Well, let me go back to the verse that we used in the slide. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. One of my favorite people to read and read about is a guy by the name of Marcus Garvey. I know Barbara will be Dr. Davis, you'll be very familiar with this. Marcus Garvey was a phenomenal thinker. Not the best at execution in the final analysis, but his philosophies were light years ahead of the time. Light years. Marcus Garvey has a saying that the Rastafarians sing in a lot of reggae songs. So that's why it's so easy for me to remember it. A people without a knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. And Black history is so all encompassing that to not teach it really is a disadvantage, especially if you're in a predominantly Black school. Now, I'm going to speak in a second about how it should be taught and the purpose of its teaching. But some of my favorite history is actually Haitian history. Why would I love Haitian history so much? Because it was Haiti that threw off the shackles of French colonialism and imperialism before any country in the world. They ended slavery themselves, right? Now, that's something you need to know. Why? Because you're going to hear all your life how terribly poor Haiti is. You're going to hear all your life about how backwards Haiti is. And unless you understand the history, you'll never know that when Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture threw off the shackles of French slavery and imperialism and colonialism, the French taxed them. They burdened Haiti with financial concerns that no other country in the world had, and basically raped Haiti financially for decades and centuries. Haiti isn't poor today because Haitians are poor people. Haiti is poor today as a retaliation against the liberation of the country by violent revolution. That's why Haiti's poor. And I remember when the earthquake hit Haiti, there was some white Christian evangelicals saying it's because Haiti was founded in voodoo and voodoo this and voodoo that. If that's the case, why is America still standing? There's more witchcraft in America than anywhere, right? I mean, witchcraft is huge. Hollywood is witchcraft. Let's just be honest. But unless you understand the history, you can't value Haiti and Haitians. That's just one tiny example of the importance of Black history. You've got to understand what they did and the consequences of it. Because if you don't, you look at Haiti and you think, well, what a poor country. And you don't understand they're poor because they paid for their freedom in blood, and their generations pay for it till today. How do you not teach a Black child that? How does every Black child in the world not know that? And I guarantee you, if you went to every Black church in America today and polled them as to why is Haiti poor, they would blame it on the Haitian people. You understand? And the same thing is true for Jamaica. People don't realize Jamaica was raped by the British. The British are not civil people. You grow up Jamaican, you think that the British were such wonderful people. The British stole the bauxite. They enslaved people. They were supposed to be Christians, but they treated people very poorly for many years, and that's how they got so wealthy. So when you look at Jamaica, even our country, the United States, it was Bill Clinton who sent in subsidized powdered milk into Jamaica and destroyed the Jamaican dairy industry. He sent in subsidized American rice into Haiti and destroyed rice production in Haiti, which is why the people in Haiti actually began to starve once the subsidies wore off and the prices went up. So if you don't understand history, you won't understand the whys of the world. You won't understand why things are the way they are so that you can better address them without thinking, these people are hopeless. It's just the way it is. When I go to Jamaica and I see the conditions in Jamaica, I understand that Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean could be self-sufficient. All of the islands together could grow whatever they want. And there's reasons it doesn't happen. Black history is important. Now, that said, I like what you say about the fear of radicalization, because once you start hearing all this history, you get mad. That's what you get. I get mad. And I'm not. The people like celebrate the French. I can't celebrate the French. The French are still pulling millions of dollars out of African countries. I mean, just horrible. A lot of the poverty in Africa is for the same reason it is in Haiti. But this is where my Christianity comes in. How do Black Christians respond? We respond differently. And the example of that is also in Black history. It is in the civil rights movement. How did some of the most oppressed people on the planet, sitting on the backs of buses, not able to, if you wanted food in Alabama 70, 80 years ago, you had to drive to the back of the restaurant and they'd hand you your food out of a window. Not even the dignity to walk in and get the food. You were treated as less than human. And we can go on and on and on and on. How did they change that? A bloodless revolution, a non-violent rebellion. That history must also be taught. They turned the other cheek. They allowed hoses to be turned on them, dogs to be loosed on them. They prayed for their enemies, literally prayed for their enemies, and sang hymns as they changed America. They literally taught America what it means to be Christian when America thought she was Christian. That is Black history. That is the power of the gospel in our history. And one of the reasons you have to teach Black history, it is a very Christian history, going all the way back to the church of Ethiopia and Abyssinia, who kept the Sabbath when during the Dark Ages, Rome had everyone learning basically heresies. It was Africa. Read the Great Controversy. Africa, where the church was kept pure. Or read the history of the Ethiopian church, another good book. So knowing Black history will protect you spiritually as well, to understand all of these different things. And I could go on as the power that Black Christianity has had in the lives of men like Jackie Robinson. People don't tell you every night when he was suffering the racist attacks on the baseball field, he went home every night and prayed to God for self-control, so that when he was called these names, these racial epithets, he would not respond in kind. They don't tell you that. They don't tell you Rosa Parks says her strength came from knowing God and giving it over to him. Our history is important because it doesn't just teach you things that might make you angry. It teaches you about a God who keeps you calm. And if you learn the two sides of those things, you'll be far more effective in this society.
Dr. Walsh, thank you so much for sharing such valuable information with us today. We are thankful that you chose to join us, and we are hoping and praying that our audience did glean from it the importance of Seventh-day Adventist Christian education, and especially in the lives of our Black and brown children. So for this Black History edition of SEC Education That Transforms, I just want to say a big thank you to you for taking the time to be with us. Magali, it's over to you now.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. And again, Dr. Walsh, it is always a pleasure to speak with you. And like Dr. Davis said, thank you for teaching us today and reminding us of just how important and transformative Adventist education is. Thank you also to our viewers for joining us today as we learned from Dr. Walsh. We hope that you were blessed, as I know that Dr. Davis and I were. We look forward to our appointment next week. We'll be waiting for you here for Education That Transforms at 3 p.m. In the meantime, please stay blessed, stay safe, and stay tuned for No Limits with Mithra Williams. Have a great week.